Hi folks, it's a great pleasure to bring you this mini lecture on recent trauma research of 2020 and 2021. I thought it would be good to look, by doing a search limited to 2021 and 2020 on trauma and memory types of papers to see what's going on now. When I did look at it, I found some of the findings familiar, but it just shows that there is quite a lot of replication, and you'll see, if you know the literature from before, you'll notice that it is quite incremental. In any given year, you don't usually have breakthroughs, but you have reinforcement of past ideas, and sometimes you have debunking of some recent ideas as well. So I think I feel very lucky to talk about this because I just love some of the research that I found in my search to put this talk together. So the first study I found was by Thom et al. 2020 on the neural correlates of trauma-related autobiographical memory in post-traumatic stress disorder. So they did a meta-analysis on all past studies, and they found that control participants who do not have PTSD tended to have greater brain activation in the prefrontal medial cortex. Now, the prefrontal medial cortex are suggested to facilitate retrieval monitoring. So what they're saying is individuals who do not have PTSD show more activation of this prefrontal cortex that helps retrieval monitoring. So in other words, they're good at monitoring what's true and what's not in their retrieval. Now, PTSD participants show more activation in the posterior medial cortex, and that is thought to enable visual imagery processing of autobiographical memory. So in other words, PTSD individuals' brain scans are showing activation in an area showing visual imagery processing. In other words, they're vividly imagining the scene in their mind's eye, right? So that's the differences that they found. And they say that taken together, reduced common activation of prefrontal cortices may be interpreted as a bias towards greater re-experiencing, right? So that's in the PTSD group, where the most salient elements of the traumatic memory are relived as opposed to retrieved in a controlled manner in PTSD, right? So this is an interesting finding, and it is in the realm of fairly good controlled science. So I just wanted to emphasize that there is some pseudoscience in trauma research, but there's a branch of research like this which is pretty solid stuff, right? And you know this already, but they used fMRI, I think, in almost all of these studies that they did a meta-analysis on. Now, let's move on to a couple of findings from Payton Jones's dissertation, just 2021. I've put a link to his dissertation video in the extra activities if you want to have a look at it. But I saw this a couple of months ago, and I was so impressed by it. Thought it touched upon trauma and how you define trauma, whether you can expand the idea of trauma, and what consequences does it have if you expand the concept of trauma too broadly, right? So an interesting little story is that I met Payton Jones at the Heterodox Academy in, I think it was 2018 or something like that. And we got into talking about false memory and trauma research quite well. I know his advisor, Richard McNally, which is probably somebody who you're familiar with from your readings. So anyway, I've noticed that Rich McNally is very good at advising his students to topics that are very valuable additions to what we need to know for the memory wars and so on. So, if you remember, he advised Susan Clancy, and then she wrote the book, The Memory Myth. So they really interviewed individuals with childhood sexual abuse to find out what was really going on. And similarly with Payton Jones's research, it was very well directed, and I'll show you some of it now. And I asked Payton if he could send me the slides because I was just so impressed, so that I could share it in my trauma course. So it's mostly about trauma, and you see why in a second. Here you see how Payton started his discussion off. So he said, what are the countries with the highest rates of PTSD diagnosis? And the highest one is Canada. You have Australia very high too. but violence in those countries is actually quite low. If we go on, the United States is also very high in its diagnosis of PTSD, 6.8%. Some of the highest rates in the world these are. And when you compare that to areas of the world which are very violent and you actually face more traumas, such as Brazil, Colombia especially, I think it's very violent right now, Mexico, you face high violence in all of these green states here, Iraq. You can see the PTSD diagnosis is much lower than the other states that have less violence. So there's kind of a unusual reversed relationship between actual violence recorded in crime statistics in a country, such as murders, homicides, assaults, and things like that, and PTSD, which is higher in some of the least violent countries. All right, so that raises a question. What is going on with the concept of trauma, and how do we define being traumatized, and so on? We might come to some possible answers if we stick with that question. Now, just to demonstrate this, Payton also showed how there's a mismatch between crime levels going down, but reports of PTSD going up. So let's take the left graph here. You can see that PTSD diagnosis from 2002 goes down a little bit, and then it's been increasing ever since 2012. Now you compare that relationship of increase in diagnosis, and I think it carried on going up after that too, I'm not sure. But you see that all the other graphs here on the right show actual crime statistics in that same country, the United States. So you could see that violent crime went down from 2002 to 2012, rape went down, aggravated assault went down during that period, and homicide went down during that period too. But PTSD rates did not match the same graph shape, right? So that's a mismatch as well within a country. So, how do you answer this phenomena? All right, let's move on. Let's see if we can find some answers. So in Payton's first study in his dissertation, he looked at whether you can shift trauma thresholds, whether you can give tasks to individuals to categorize trauma in such a way that you might shift their threshold of what they categorize as trauma and what they don't categorize as trauma. So, for example, individuals would be given tasks like this. They would be given sentences to categorize into not trauma or into trauma. So in this case, you could give them was spanked by parents, and then you have to decide whether that's traumatic or not traumatic. Another example was smelled a trash can, and then you have to put that into press the F key or the J key. If you think it's not traumatic, then you press F. If you think it's traumatic, press J. Or you might be presented with very severe traumas too. And the severity of the trauma sentences seem to predict how people's categorization can shift. So for example, if you give them something very strong like this, had their tongue cut out by a stranger, if you give them a lot of severe traumas like that, the shift in categorization tends to become more conservative. In other words, you only start to categorize traumas as being traumatic if they are as severe as the previous sentences that you've categorized, right? And accidentally shot and killed a friend during warfare. Right, so that's another one of the severe types of trauma that would shift individuals' categorization of trauma to be more severe. But the idea is that if you give a lot of fairly innocuous sentences, the definition of trauma will become less conservative, and you start including some just mildly stressful things as being traumatic because your criteria shift downwards, and compared to the other items that you've been categorizing, some item like such as losing a dog, might start to be put into the trauma category. It may be explained by relative judgments. So this is the kind of materials that Payton showed participants, and they had to categorize. Another example was knocked unconscious by a bicycle accident. That's another example of something that maybe most people would consider traumatic. And here are the results that Payton found, and I'm probably going to describe them a little bit inaccurately, but his dissertation is available to see on that link I put online. But what he found was that if you see the blue range here, you see that if all of the examples that you give are fairly not traumatic, then the criteria shifts to the left, where you start to categorize things as being traumatic that other people would not categorize as being traumatic. But if you only give them severe types of trauma, then their criteria moves to the other side, right? So you find this relationship where those groups who had low range traumas presented to them and they categorized them, they found that they became very sensitive to the slightest trauma, and they started categorize things as being traumatic which were just maybe medium stressful. On the other hand, those individuals who were in the severe range, right? So they got severe sentences such as cutting your tongue out. Their criteria shifted to become more strict. So they would reject mildly stressful things as being traumatic. They would categorize that as being not traumatic, right? So Payton did this great work in showing that what we categorize as traumatic is very relative to what we're thinking about previously. Or what we're exposed to previously, right? So that might explain that as violence has gone down in society, our criteria of labeling trauma has also shifted downwards, which is a trade-off. You know, there might be some benefits to that and there might be some disadvantages to that. I always tend to think of things like this as being trade-offs, right? So if you identify stressful things as being problematic, that might actually help, but it might actually come with problems as well. So the summary that Payton put together is that people broaden their definitions of when serious events are absent. In other words, if you're not categorizing serious events, your definition of trauma broadens so that you start to call mid-range stressful things as traumatic. That's what he found. Now, another study he did, and some of these are published in peer-reviewed journals. Some of them are not yet published, but they could be soon. The other thing that he talked about is trigger warnings for potentially traumatic events, right? This is why I don't give trigger warnings about the content of the course too much, apart from that general statement that I made at the beginning of the course, is because of these types of findings. Sometimes it makes anxiety worse if you warn somebody that there's a difficult video coming up. You often find that you have a reverse effect. And there's some great research done, not just by Payton, but also by Marianne Gary's students as well. The results of this trigger warning study was that in the full sample of his participants, he found that trigger warnings led to a very, very, very slight increase in anxiety, which was not a significant difference from zero. But interestingly, those who had PTSD, they met the clinical cutoff for PTSD, he found that trigger warnings are, these warnings like this, you might find this video disturbing, people have felt anxious and we want to warn you about that, and the kind of thing. People with PTSD actually became more anxious if they had trigger warnings, so they would have been better off without a trigger warning at the beginning of the video. I think it was a video that they showed, or some traumatic footage or pictures or something like that. I can't quite remember. Those who had self-reported PTSD, there's not much difference from zero, slightly negative, which means a very slight decrease in anxiety, but that's not a significant difference. But anyway, there you have it. You see that there's no, let's put it this way, there's no clear benefit for trigger warnings for potentially traumatic events. So this may vary from situation to situation. Television programs may have to include trigger warnings for practical reasons, but if you're talking about the effect of trigger warnings of a disturbing video or pictures on later anxiety, it doesn't seem to reduce anxiety, let's put it that way. There may be some moral arguments that you should have trigger warnings in some cases, but there you have the results. And here you see the results showing that when you did get a trigger warning, your centrality of event scale went slightly up. What this means is if you are given a trigger warning, you are more likely to later call that event that you saw as being central. Think of it as being central in your life compared to if you did not get a trigger warning. So what this graph is showing that one of the problems with trigger warnings is you start to think of the event that you're warned about as being a centrally important thing in your life, which is perhaps a negative effect of trigger warnings. So the summary of study 3 is trigger warnings don't do much in terms of a benefit, of reduced anxiety later. They slightly increase vulnerability via event centrality. In other words, you start to think that the video that you saw is more central, more important than it actually is, and then that could really lead to focusing and re-remembering that event more than need be, or looking at that event as causing anxiety. So that's how the mechanism might work when you see the increase in anxiety in those who had trigger warnings. Payton also presented this graph in his dissertation, which I think is from one of his papers, that shows a number of different studies and the effects of trigger warnings on them. You know, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 studies, right? And you can see on the right-hand side column here, response anxiety. You can see that any positive effects above 0 means that anxiety went up when you had a trigger warning, which is not really what you want. And you can see that in most of these studies, apart from one, anxiety was going in the wrong direction. So trigger warnings were making anxiety go up. Sometimes that was not statistically significant, but nevertheless, you did not see consistent reductions in anxiety. So in other words, trigger warnings didn't help consistently. And here is a breakdown of different emotions and the effect of trigger warnings on different emotions. And you can see that trigger warnings tended to increase very slightly, but these are not significant results for the most part. Anxiousness, afraid, angry, disgusted, and sad, the negative emotions kind of increased a little bit with trigger warnings because they go to the right of the graph here. And if you look at content and happy, these positive emotions, they become slightly negative, but not statistically significantly negative. They're actually using Bayes analysis rather than statistical differences here. But nevertheless, slight reductions in positive emotions as a result of trigger warnings, right? So again, there's some evidence there that negative emotions go up, positive emotions go down, but very, very slightly. Now, to try and pull together an explanation of what is going on with PTSD going up and real violence going down and the differences between countries that we looked at, the broadening of trauma as a concept, Payton mentioned Campbell's and Manning's book in 2018 called The Rise of Victimhood Culture, and they explain it this way. They talk about honor cultures, which are already established, and they give honors cultures such as the American South, where insults are taken very seriously and the social value is the defense of the group. Dignity cultures, for example, Britain or the North of America, insults are taken as meaningless. The dignity culture people kind of believe no one can make you feel inferior without your consent. That's a general part of the culture. And social value is inherent. It's proved by quiet self-assuredness. That's a type of culture. And of course, cultures change over time and within region as well. But what I wanted to get to here is the new idea, the rise of a different type of culture that is a kind of a strange mix of honor culture and dignity culture. And that's called the victimhood culture that Campbell and Manning argue has risen up in college campuses. I think they talked about US college campuses. I think it might be different in the UK, in online forums and so on. And here it's slightly different from the other types of cultures in that insults are taken to be extremely serious, just like the honor culture, right? Especially if there's a power imbalance, right? So slight insults that may not even be insults are taken to be extremely serious if they come from somebody from a higher rank. And social value is derived in this new culture with membership in a lower power class. You know, so you identify with a class that is oppressed or something like that. And it's proved by being victimized. Like, so you might not be victimized yourself, but you categorize yourself in with an identity group that has been victimized in the past or is being victimized in some areas, but you're not personally, and that kind of thing. So these are the differences in culture that might help explain some of the phenomena that we're seeing with broadening of trauma, and how it is less stigmatizing to say nowadays in a victimhood culture, it's less stigmatizing to say that I'm a victim or I've been traumatized, right? So that is part of the attempted explanation here. And if the world is divided between victims and perpetrators, surely it is better to be a victim. So this is something that Jonathan Haidt said. So that is part of the victimhood culture that may explain some of what we're seeing. In other words, the stigma of being a victim has gone down in victimhood culture, right? So that's part of it. And here is another way that Payton argued what may be happening here. So in the past, if you were a victim or traumatized, or if you claimed to be a victim, there was a lot of stigma in the distant past. You see the red graph here, back here. You can see that there's just so much stigma attached to publicly saying that you're a victim or being traumatized that you would not want to report it. And of course, that's a problem. It's a matter of trade-offs here, isn't it? And then as time's gone by, the stigma of being traumatized or victimized or having PTSD or having any mental disorder has gone down, which is a really good thing. But at the same time, the idea is from Campbell and Manning and Payton Jones's idea is that social rewards for claiming victimhood may have also slightly increased. So he says that we're kind of here where there is still some stigma, but now there's some social rewards. So that may explain why you might broaden the definition of trauma. And because stigma's gone down, so you don't feel afraid to say that you've got PTSD, and there may even be some social reward within a victimhood culture of having a mental disorder and so on. So there's pros and cons here, isn't there? It's a trade-off. There's definitely progress here. We do want stigma to go down. What this does do is, right or wrong, it explains why we might see a shift in criteria for PTSD or for trauma and for other mental disorders as well. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It may lead to better treatment, but there may be some disadvantages too. So that was Payton Jones's dissertation. I just pulled out some of the things most relevant to the course. You can click on the dissertation to get the PDF if you're interested in the slides. And I think 2 articles have come out from this. One of them is not being published yet, and there they are with the links there if you want to get to them. Now let's move on. Now another recent study that I thought I'd bring to you, a really recent 2021 study, was done by Matson and colleagues, called The Accuracy of Traumatic Memories in PTSD. A review of papers. So what they did is they reviewed to investigate the accuracy of traumatic memories in persons with a diagnosis of PTSD. They looked at 11 studies. They used 3 different methods of measuring memory accuracy, such as coherence, which is how the memory sticks together, change in recollection of trauma over time, and remembering details of trauma. So it sounds to me that they have not been able to verify with some fact that it's true or not, but they're just, what they're doing here is more that if there's a lot of details, and they're saying that might be accurate. If they're saying if the recollection has changed over time, that might be signs of inaccuracy. So this is not a perfect study. I can recognize just by reading this that they have not checked it with factual information, because it's so hard to do actually. But what they did find is some inconsistencies, but most of the studies concluded that the memory of trauma is as accurate in people with PTSD as those without PTSD, right? And they say the only recurring difference identified across studies was in recollection of trauma over time. The findings are of importance both clinically and for the legal system. But they did find, actually, out of those 11, 3 studies found deficiency in accuracy of traumatic memory in those with PTSD, I think. All right, so that just gives you an idea of some of the research going on. Not very big differences in accuracy between those remembering trauma who have PTSD and those remembering trauma who don't have PTSD from that trauma. And another study by Kim et al., 2021, I thought was quite interesting. They have a study saying that online guided imagery in traumatic memory processing for at-risk complex PTSD adults. So they did an online task where people would use guided imagery. That's like imagining in your mind's eye, something I talked about. It's related to imagination inflation, although it might not always be bad. First, I want to talk about what complex PTSD is, because I think it will really round out your understanding from this course and have you ready to recognize words like complex PTSD and think and link it to things that I think you should link it to. So complex PTSD, according to the NHS, and there's a link here in the slides if you want to look, may be diagnosed in adults or children who have repeatedly experienced traumatic events such as violence, neglect, or abuse, right? Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So you have situations where that could have actually happened, but you know that in some cases memories can be distorted with the idea of repeated abuse coming back that actually didn't happen. It's quite rare, but it does happen. Now, the interesting thing about the NHS definition here is symptoms can include periods of losing attention and concentration, and they put dissociation in parentheses here. So they don't have much emphasis here, but that's the link I want you to remember and just to look out for. Complex PTSD is PTSD with some dissociation and a whole bunch of other things, by the way, such as repeated trauma or alleged repeated trauma. Now, some go further than that and link it to dissociation, dissociative amnesia, and so on a little bit more in detail than the NHS does. I think the NHS is being careful in its wording, which is good, but some people are less careful. In the article by Cook et al. Called Complex Trauma in Children and Adolescents, which you can see involves Bessel van der Kolk as a co-author, published in Psychiatric Annals, they say that complex PTSD is all the other things that we talked about, which is, repeated abuse, that's severe in childhood and so on. But they also say that it will include dissociation, including dissociative amnesia, depersonalization, and discrete states of consciousness, right? That you might find in dissociative identity disorder, with discrete memories, affect and functioning, and impaired memory for state-based events, which is the kind of what we talked about in dissociative amnesia, right? So what I'm trying to get your mind to do here is when you hear complex PTSD, understand that it's kind of PTSD where some people think the abuse is more severe and it can lead to dissociation. So you might have a court case, for example, that talks about complex PTSD. Nobody on the case understands any red flags about that. But what I want you to get from this course is to know that complex PTSD may be code for PTSD with dissociative amnesia or dissociative identity disorder. I've been alert to this connection for, maybe as much as 10 years now. And I did not, because there's so much to talk about in the course, I did not talk about this earlier in the course. So I just want to take one slide making that connection. And let's go on to what they found in their results on the next slide. So they found in their study, so this was a randomized controlled trial, investigated the effects of online guided imagery on traumatic memory processing in adults at risk of complex PTSD. And they found that both treatment groups had positive changes in affect and trauma-related emotions and cognitive appraisals that persisted after 1 week. So in other words, what they found here is with individuals that may have had real trauma or may not have had real trauma, I think maybe these individuals actually did have real trauma just because of the effects here. When they use guided imagery to reimagine that trauma, it seemed to actually help improve emotion and affect. In other words, negative emotions went down, positive emotions went up, and to help change the cognitive appraisals that persisted after 1 week. All right, so this adds a little bit of nuance, doesn't it, to what we were talking about with guided imagery earlier on the course. We know that imagination inflation can inflate your confidence in something that happened that didn't actually happen, but perhaps guided imagery, if you're dealing with real traumas that are properly remembered, reimagining them may actually help reconsolidate it in such a way that you resolve it a little bit, you put it back into memory with less emotion than you pulled it out, you know. So what is crucial in treatment, I think, is whether the trauma is real or not. If so, working with that memory can help reconsolidate in such a way so it's not so emotional anymore. But if you do not have a real trauma to start with, then guided imagery might be iatrogenic, of course. Isn't this interesting? So this is just this year, 2021. So I hope you've enjoyed this talk on very recent research in trauma and memory. We talked about the Thom et al. Study where people with PTSD show lower prefrontal activation during recollection of trauma scripts. That means lower retrieval monitoring in their prefrontal cortex compared to healthy controls. In Jones' dissertation, 2021, we pulled out a few things such as trigger warnings of upsetting material do not work in reducing anxiety. He talks about how the trauma concept can be broadened and perhaps has been broadened, how PTSD has increased while violence has decreased, and a cultural explanation of that in that stigma of being a victim has decreased and social rewards increased is a question that he asked that might explain some of the phenomenon. And then we talked about the Matheson et al. 2021 study where PTSD folks remember trauma equally accurately as non-PTSD. And then we talked about complex PTSD as being new terminology that can mean PTSD with dissociative symptoms. That's one of the benefits of going over recent research is, as I went over it, it just occurred to me that connection has not been made in the course before. So there's different terminologies, as you can see. You know, some people might use trauma dissociation to contain their beliefs in dissociative amnesia. Some people might think about complex PTSD to kind of stretch the definitions of PTSD to dissociative amnesia. Some people might use repressed memories. That's not very common anymore. But the findings of that study were that Lee et al. Found that reported guided imagery improved emotions in complex PTSD. So in other words, in the groups that they used guided imagery to go over past traumas, they saw short-term, and maybe it lasted, but we don't know, a short-term improvement in positive affect and in negative affect in people who are vulnerable to complex PTSD. Okay, that's all for this lecture. This is just me pulling out a few articles. I've enjoyed looking at them. It's quite a lot of work to read through them, and there's a lot of articles that I thought were too incremental to include here, but I did look at them and then didn't use them in this talk. So I think what I can conclude from this research is similar to what I concluded in the current false memory research lecture, is that some of these findings are familiar to me. It's some things that we've kind of found recently, but it's been reinforced this year. So science in this area seems to be very incremental at the moment. For example, Jones's work on trigger warnings, there was some work done before him in 2017, I think, and things like that. The idea of PTSD, remembering things just about as accurately as people with non-PTSD, is something that's not surprising. It's similar to things I've seen before. But as you can see, the ideas that some of the ideas that have been developed about what PTSD is, what trigger warnings, whether trigger warnings help, and so on, is quite often tested every single year. And if it is kind of a falsifiable theory, then that theory will adjust with all the new findings. So that's the state of the art this year, and hope you enjoyed it. I certainly learned a lot from this lecture, but it was quite hard putting it together. Okay, talk to you later. Bye.